Take two, camera.
I was sitting there quietly minding my own business and developing some other stuff. And Walter Parkes called me up and said, have you got 20 minutes? And threw a reproduction of this rather beautiful 19th century painting onto my desk. And I stared at it and I went, oh God, because I knew I was essentially, you want to bleep this? I was fucked.
Once we got to a point where everyone knew what we were doing, they thought we were mad. You know, $100 million movie about a guy who kills innocent people and animals for a living.
You have to, in the end, understand who is it who gets their way. Because when you have disagreements, somebody has to give way.
Sophisticated feats of engineering, coupled with enormous set building, under the pressure of budget and schedule.
We weren't getting a lot of sleep because it was long, long hours.
Everyone had failed with Sword and Sandal for 40 years.
It was a risk for everybody. Would an audience come back?
When I was a kid, I did a year of graduate school, got sick of the university, as we all do. Bummed around Europe, East Bloc, West Bloc, saw a lot of coliseums. When I got to Baghdad, I swapped a book on the Irish Revolution for a book by a guy named Daniel P. Mannix called Those About to Die, which is a very tawdry sort of overview of the Coliseum and the games. But the thing that was great about Mannix's book was that it identified the ancient games with sort of modern entertainment games. And I never forgot about it. I always thought, gee, it'd make a great movie someday. And by the time I got to India, I think I decided I wanted to be a screenwriter. So, you know, years later, when I was writing Amistad in Rome, I began researching Gladiator and working on the script.
I had worked with David Franzoni on one other project, and he came to me with some research about the Roman arena. And as you looked at the researchers, I looked at the research, you realize it was completely the epicenter of the whole society. And in the way that in that period of time, all roads led to Rome, all roads in Rome led to the arena. And it was the center of technology. They were literally eradicating species of animals on the world because they were taking so many to destroy in their arena in more and more theatrical ways. But as we read the research, it felt very contemporary. There are a lot of ideas of a whole population distracted by entertainment while they were missing the more serious issues that felt very much like now.
I think behavior of people is odd because it doesn't really change, does it? I think the weapons change, the clothing changes, but fundamentally people's behavior doesn't change. Politics are all essentially the same. I would even say you get equally the same amount of backstabbing today as you did then. Now it's a bit more metaphorical.
If we went to a Roman amphitheatre to watch the games, it would seem enormously familiar in some ways. You know, the way you get your ticket and you're shown to your proper seat, and the vendors come around and you buy refreshments, and it might seem perfectly ordinary. And then you realize that the spectacle is different.
Just like in a modern either soccer or American football stadium where they love to see people hit and get hurt and, you know, the ranting of 50, 60, 70,000 people.
And we have the word WWF, and we have all of the different sort of wrestling things, and we have, you know, professional boxing is still the biggest thing on TV when there's a heavyweight fight.
It's a question that we've all been asking and debating about is, you know, what is the desire for blood sport and people, you know, what is that? Is it an escape?
I think what pulls us to Gladiators is the adrenaline. There is a real excitement. Sport is exciting. Blood sport is that much more exciting. And I think there's a sort of morbid fascination the present has with the Roman past, because we ask all the time, could we be like these guys? Could we sit around 50,000 people in a great building watching someone die, cheering? Could we be like it? Or are they completely different from us? Are they monsters? Did they work differently as human beings? And I think we know that there's a bit in us that is absolutely there with the Romans. We could be like them.
When you think about the amphitheatre, whether you're watching two people fighting or a person and an animal, there's an element of unpredictability there, which is balanced out by the comparative skill of the two participants. And that kind of sort of gambling on the odds, I think, was a great attraction in those days and must also still be an attraction now. Although I think the major attraction today of looking at the Roman amphitheatre is through the telescope of time, looking at this sort of frozen cultural phenomenon, which seems so alien and yet in some ways fulfills many of the instincts that we have been taught not to indulge.
What was most important about it, and I think was least interesting to me, were the way they'd done Roman epics in the past was trying to capture, I think they were trying to capture what it must have been like to be an ancient Roman or an ancient Greek. And I don't think that's possible, first of all. And secondly, I don't find it very interesting.
We know that sword and sandal movies had been failing for about 40 years when we started work on Gladiator. And I think my best analysis was that they just felt locked in the past.
What I was trying to find a way in with Colosseum for us on Gladiator was, how is this about us? You know, how is this about the United States? And when I first talked to Steven Spielberg about it, I told Steven, I said, you know, in a way, this really isn't about ancient Rome at all. This is about Los Angeles 1,000 years from now. Coliseum is Dodger Stadium. I modeled Proximo very consciously after a CIA agent. I mean, I used to say Mike Ovitz, but it could have been any CIA agent. And we have, you know, I guess a modern morality play. So I had it all kind of worked out, and I went in to see Steven. And Steven had heard that I was going to come in and pitch a Gladiator piece. So the meeting was basically, it was Steven and Walter Parks, and Steven goes, so David, I understand you want to do a movie about a gladiator. And I go, yeah. In ancient Rome, yeah. In the Colosseum in ancient Rome, yes. Okay. And that was it. So I remember Walter called me that afternoon and goes, you know, David, do you have a story worked out? And I said, you know, I've got it all worked out, Walter, so don't fear. But Steven knew it was time.
It was just one of those pitches that, on a conceptual level, made sense immediately. I mean, a lot of people have talked about, gee, you know, why did you all get behind a movie the likes of which hadn't been made for such a long time? But I don't know why. The timing for this movie just seemed right when we heard it the first time. And as I said, the emotional contour, again, in the very most rudimentary form, the emotional contours were there of this basic hero's journey.
After we had solved the script, and we had a real character journey set in the Roman arena, the question of filmmaker was really daunting.
We were looking for someone with vision, of course, you know, and there were sort of, you know, two balls to keep up in the air on this. One was we were doing a serious, dramatic piece, and performances were crucial. The other was we were making this fantastic spectacle. We were doing sort of a theme park, if you will. And so we needed a director who had those capabilities.
You know, we talked about the short list of people that can do that kind of work. And on the short list, of course, is Ridley Scott. There's maybe no one who's ever been better at creating a coherent other world. You know, you think of what he did in Blade Runner.
There's a tiny, tiny handful of directors who can create worlds, who can deal with enormous technical problems, and here's the important point, but not be overwhelmed by them, not literally forsake the really important issues of narrative and story and theme because the pursuit of the size is crushing. When you really look at that list, you go right to Ridley.
Unlike many people, Ridley's an artist. He often jokes about spending his twilight years in some garden painting. And so Walter Parks and I went to see Ridley, and we brought the script, and we also brought a painting, a famous painting of the arena.
The artist was Jean-Léon Gérôme, and it was entitled Thumbs Down. And it shows a corner of the Colosseum, the wall, and one seems to be looking back up at what probably is one of the more corrupt of the emperors. It looks like Nero, I think, who's actually leaning over in a kind of rather debauched state with his thumb down, indicating that the Antibatai who is the armored gladiator, who's standing over the vanquished, who is still alive, and he's looking up at the emperor saying, should I kill him or not? And the guy's doing that, which means death.
I remember showing him the picture and then launched into the pitch. Doug and I told him about how we're going to change the script and what our ideas are. And I remember talking to him, and he'd be looking at me very interested, and his eyes would glaze slightly, and his eyes kept on going to the picture. He'd come back to me very politely, kept on going to the picture. And I think halfway through, without really hearing the pitch at all, he picked up the print and said, yeah, I can do this.
I just loved the whole, you know, view, that segment was what really turned me on to it. Saying, we can do that. And we haven't seen that. And certainly not with the technology we can employ today, where we don't have to build the whole arena. We can build a segment of the arena, we can expand on that, we can do all kinds of things, and, you know, really do an epic in the grand sense of the word.
When you go to the ruins of Rome now, you get really no sense of the scale and the grandeur of what that forum would have been. It's hard to get it anywhere except from some of the great epic films of the past, like Ben-Hur and Quo Vadis and The Fall of the Roman Empire, who did elaborate reconstructions.
When I was a kid, there was this TV series that was made in England called I, Claudius. And I saw that, and I was, like, fascinated.
I think he knows what Rome is.
When I saw that Derek Jacobi was going to be in our movie, I was so thrilled, because I remembered what a genius job he did on I, Claudius.
My favorite moment in any previous epic was the chariot race in Ben-Hur. I can't think of anything that was more cinematic, more exciting, and also full of character.
In both chariot races and Ben-Hur, the 1929 Ben-Hur, I think it's 1929, is amazing chariot race, absolutely amazing. And then later Charlton Heston's. There were some very good things about that. They got the scale right.
We stood in the shadow of all the other epic Roman films ever done. A lot of these stood as examples of what not to do. The trend toward the end in the 50s and 60s was a theatricality of a style of language which had more to do with, I think, classical Shakespearean theater.
Doing these things, you're always trying to find the level of dialogue that flies so it doesn't become a deeply period piece where you lose 9/10 of the audience immediately.
How can I reward Rome's greatest general?
Let me go home.
I did my basic research for Gladiators, you know, spent a lot of time hanging out in the Coliseum. But it gets to a point where you sort of hit saturation, where you go, okay, I'm not smart enough to get this right anymore. And by this time, meanwhile, I'm writing the script for DreamWorks at this point, and we brought in Kathleen Coleman, who now teaches at Harvard, teaches a class in the Roman games, if you can believe that. She came in, obviously, and started going, no, David, that's not right, or yes, David, that could work, or who the hell knows, in which case I'd use it, of course.
The written sources don't ever discuss amphitheater spectacles in detail. They're all incidentally mentioned in the larger context of some other issue.
Remember, history is only written down by people, and that's their report on what they think at the time or what other historians have written at the time.
It's difficult to recover the view of Mr. Average Roman going to the amphitheater except by indirect means. The fact that the Roman Empire is absolutely littered with amphitheaters and other structures in which gladiatorial spectacles took place is one pointer to the fact that there must have been a huge attraction about these spectacles.
This is a Roman-designed building, basically using the idea of a theater, but putting two of them face to face. And it was for a specific form of Roman entertainment, which was combat between two fighters, possibly to the death. This has its origin in funeral games, the idea being to make a human sacrifice to the gods of the underworld on the occasion of a funeral. so that we know the first of these human sacrifice gladiatorial games took place during a funeral here in Rome in around 250 BC.
What I would say about research is, if you can use it well, reality gives you stuff you could never invent. And it's a fantastic resource, but you have to use it well. You are writing a story, you're not writing history. And your story, I think, has got to come first.
What you can really do is actually pinpoint the dates, which are probably accurate, pinpoint the times, pinpoint the characters, then do a bit of research about each of those characters, and then try and deduce who they were.
There was a Roman general who sort of matched this historically, who when Commodus became emperor disappeared because he was a great general and knew that he was on the hit list. No one ever knows what became of him. So I took a little bit of that, what we did know of him, and put it into Maximus's character.
The thing that most helped us was building the whole movie around a character. Because right away, you let go of the burden of we're somehow trying to recreate ancient Rome in a very specific period of time, and instead saying we're telling you a story of character. We're telling you about a man trying to find his way home. We're telling you a story about someone finding inner strength in a tough time. And right away, that's a kind of mythic story that is relevant to everybody in the audience, struggling with their own day, with their own ethics, with their own principles.
Around that, I think was one of the most interesting characters of the movie was Commodus, who was this dysfunctional, I think extremely sympathetic young emperor who people mostly just perceive as the bad guy, so a lot of it went straight over their heads. I think one of the best scenes of the film is where Commodus is told by his father that he's not going to be the emperor.
Are you ready to do your duty for Rome?
David Franzoni, the first writer, completely had the dream. And from bits of research, again, talking about people who were at the top of that society at the whim of an emperor, suddenly being a slave to fight for their life in the arena seemed incredibly fascinating. So that was all in the Franzoni control of the script.
David had brought the overall grand plan, and I think we were a bit needed the characterizations to be a little less on the nose, and the dialogue was tricky and very hard, I think, to pull off, and therefore we moved towards somebody that I'd already worked with.
Did my last draft, and then Ridley brought John Logan on, and they just worked together on a piece.
John is a very good classical playwright, and I think I needed all this information converting into a good 3-act play, drama.
John created a lot of beautiful scenes between characters. He did some fantastic work in all of those wonderful scenes in the opening, in the first act.
John Logan is a playwright, and his interest tends to be in human relationships. And, you know, I remember when I first read John's draft, and there's a moment between Richard Harris and Connie Nielsen. He says, let's not speak politics, you know, let's pretend that I'm a good father and you're a loving daughter. They walk for a few minutes and they say, this is a pleasant fiction.
Isn't it?
I found that so sophisticated. It seemed like such a, you know, wonderfully insightful, simple, yet, you know, in terms of amount of words, but complex in terms of an understanding of this relationship. So I suddenly realized, well, wait, maybe this movie could be more than just a vehicle for great action sequences and a big, brawny, heroic adventure, but maybe we can really delve into, like, the complexity of character.
I'm pretty sure most of the dialogue that survives, most of the best dialogue that survives is John Logan's.
Rome is the light.
The scenes were the same scenes, but John, you know, had spent a lot of time working on the dialogue.
Between David and John, the script really started to shape up.
Now, I had kept the family alive, his son and his wife alive, and they wanted to kill him. And I said, look, I'll tell you, right now, I mean, my only hesitation is that this isn't a revenge film. This is a movie about going home. So in Gladiator, theoretically, it isn't necessary to kill Commodus. Of course, it's, you know, feel good if you kill Commodus. But what is necessary is that he gets home. So if you kill a family, it makes it difficult. So I kept saying, you know, I'm not sure that's the right thing.
we were always wanting him to like head toward his relationship with Lucilla and Connie as a, not exactly a love affair, but kind of the emotional target in the here and now. And as long as it had to do with, yeah, but trying to double back to this other family, it just never had this kind of mythic clarity that these sorts of movies really want, you know? And it was a very liberating thing to decide, well, what if they were killed?
And, everybody, got a head of steam on it because it was a little awkward keeping the family alive. So, well, the easiest thing to do is kill them. So they killed them.
It freed up our storyline toward this kind of emotional connection with Connie, but it also sealed the deal motivationally for Maximus. The human loss that he experiences and how that motivates him, at least through the better part of the second act, gave the movie a drive that we didn't have before. Again, so these are the kinds of conversations you have in the room, and from these conversations about theme come suggestions, plots, pitches, character beats, and it just somehow in front of you, a movie takes shape.
Then they began changing the script a lot. They began taking out the sort of, issue that Maximus could go into the Colosseum and survive.
Part of the problem was that since Maximus was such a great warrior, any version of the emperor fighting him one-on-one in the arena made the emperor an imbecile. And so we kept struggling, and then in these ongoing story meetings, someone had the really smart idea of the emperor would stab Maximus, nearly killing him, suit him up, and then, of course, under those circumstances, the emperor, being cagey, could go in, finish him off in front of the crowd, and win the love of the crowd.
We have burnout because we're approaching the production, and I'm building. So Walter, in his courage, had said, "Let's go. Let's greenlight the movie." I said, "I'll come in. I'll do this, but you have to greenlight." He said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Fine." So he greenlit before we'd had a script down, which I thought was pretty brave.
Actually, we committed to do this movie with very little evidence that we could do the movie, but there was very much a shared sense, an idea, an image in everyone's head of what this movie could be.
It's interesting because now you're under full pressure. You've got to get it right. So there's no choices. I mean, we sat around the table days and days and days, literally if you're coming in, so barrier against the wall in the story, and the writer was there being grilled, and everybody's putting their brains together because everybody wants to make it right.
In these intense script meetings, Laurie MacDonald was the only female.
There had been a series of meetings that she was not able to go to because of responsibilities she had with our kids. And during those meetings, we came up with a wonderful idea for the third act, which was that about 20 pages before the end, Maximus would come back and find Lucilla has committed suicide. We thought that would really motivate him to bring down Rome. And of course, Laurie came back and was aghast. Just literally, there's one female connection to this entire movie, and you've just killed her. Good work, guys.
Probably the most bitter adjustment in the script for Ridley was Ridley kept talking about this fantastic fight between Maximus and a rhino.
Well, I always wanted to do a rhinoceros, and I wanted a rhino in North Africa. I want to show something absolutely monumentally crazy rather than just more guys.
He storyboarded the fight. We all know what a ferocious animal a rhino is. And of course, you always go from, well, wouldn't it be cool if, and then you get the reality. We started to see videotape of trained rhinos around the world. And a rhino moves very slowly unless you get it so angry, and then it's unstoppable. And there's no in-between.
The whole rhino thing would have cost us $3 million. Because I'd have to build an animatronic, because animatronics are only part of the solution. I could build a perfect rhino head, full size, from me to you, on a ram, which will look absolutely real, will snap and gouge and ram its head through a wall. And you can probably build one that actually moves, but it's going to be limited. So you're going to need also a couple of good rhinos in there that'll function, real rhinos. But the big trick really is to do it CGI.
Needless to say, a CG rhino is incredibly expensive. I think the price tag then was about $1 million. So we were always struggling with budget, as all big movies do. And one day, the rhino dropped out of the story.
We got to the point where we were having a read-through in London. And since I was a producer, even though I was no longer the writer, they couldn't get rid of me. So I had nothing to lose by saying it was on my mind. So I said, we're having the read-through tomorrow. I said, but the script still doesn't work.
It was a collaboration that was not about compromise. There was no like, oh, okay, you think this, I think that, maybe we'll settle on that. No, people had extremely passionate points of view.
We just couldn't get it all to come together. So I sent the script to Bill Nicholson just as we were starting to do a reading with all the actors at Shepperton in London. At that reading, everyone was aware that something wasn't quite right.
I was working with the producer, Doug Wick, on a quite separate project, and I got a phone call and he said, I have this project, Gladiator, and we have a problem. And the problem was that they just had a read-through. This was 2 weeks before the start of principal photography. They'd had a read-through with the cast, and it had not gone well.
Bill Nicholson sent me, faxed me, a 4-page memo that was a pretty brilliant analysis of what was missing.
I wrote a couple of pages back to him saying what I thought needed to happen to the script. And he sent those to Walter Parkes, who was the boss at DreamWorks, who was very, very much involved with Gladiator all the way through. Very important guy on Gladiator. Walter read the notes and he said, get this guy on board, pay him whatever it takes. So Doug came back to me and said, would you be prepared to do a little work on this, maybe a couple of weeks' work, and it's a production rewrite. Now that's how it began. I was on it to the end. I was on it for the next 15 weeks.
So we brought Bill in, and he kind of went the final distance and really pulled that third act together and sort of Maximus' death to joining his family in the next life.
The script that I read was like a revenge movie. It was quite dark. The main character became very nihilistic. There was quite a lot of confusion in the plotting in the second half. And I know that Ridley and Doug and Walter wanted the plot sorted out, and they wanted the characters made more likable. I mean, that's not to say that they weren't likable, but they wanted more. And that's what I wanted. I mean, I'm not an action writer. You don't hire me to write fight sequences. The fight sequences were there. They were storyboarded. They were even starting to shoot them. My job was character and structure. The key thing I identified was, this is a story of a man who wants to kill somebody. And I personally don't want to go and see a movie about somebody who wants to kill somebody. I want to go and see a movie about somebody who loves somebody. And so I thought to myself, who does he love, given that he's going to die at the end of the movie? That was the structure I inherited. Who does he love? He loves his wife and child. How can I create a plot for this story that means that his drive is to be with the people he loves rather than to slaughter a monster? The slaughtering of the monster is good, I'm not against that. It's just not the end of the story for me. Not unless you're making, I think, a lower grade movie. So the obvious answer was an afterlife.
I do think the seeds of this connection to Elysium were there. It was almost like too close for any of us to actually see. And which is why, sometimes it takes that fresh set of eyes. It took Bill, having nothing to do with this, reading the script with no background whatsoever, to say, well, this is very interesting, but my Lord, this is rather depressing. He dies at the end. How can we possibly come up with something so that, you feel that in his death he's achieved something?
We thread this through the movie so that his actual aim is to rejoin his beloved wife and child in the next life, and in that way, the act of dying becomes an act of winning, an act of triumph.
And almost like an archaeologist, an emotional archaeologist, he found the beginnings of all this in John's draft, this kind of sense of connection to the afterworld. But what was so brilliant was to decide to fully portray it, not just in dialogue, but actually visually. And of course, what that gave us, as rendered by Ridley, was a hero's death at the end, which was, you know, as satisfying as a happy ending.
They got to the point where they realized they had to have the family at the end of the film, because the movie is, again, not a revenge film. It's about a man trying to get home. And if Maximus can't get home, the movie fails. So Ridley said, well, and on German front, he said, I'll do a long-distance phone call. So when Maximus is praying, you see the family, and it worked beautifully. And then they came up with the idea of the afterlife. And I thought at the time, if anybody can do it, Ridley can do it. And if he does, it's better than my original ending, because it'll be perfect or it'll stink. And of course, Ridley turned in an absolutely magnificent vision of a pagan afterlife, of Maximus returning home.
I then started to thread that right the way through from the beginning to create a character who, instead of being a soldier who becomes a killing machine, is somebody who doesn't want to be a soldier.
A1, take 5.
The first thing you ever see, I said, we've got, before the battle even starts, we've got to have a sense that this man doesn't want to be here. If you remember the business with the bird. There's lots of ways. I wrote in, even before the battle, when he's riding along, in the beginning of the battle, he says to his men, if you find you're in green fields, don't worry, you're dead. You're in Elysium. And by planting this all the way through, and I rebuilt all of the scenes with Juba so that we could play this theme all the way through, you realize this is a man who's pursuing the ultimate, really, which is transcending death and finding love after death, which completely transforms your reaction to the man. And it makes you love him, because he's not now killing because he's so big and tough, he's killing because he has to. My own belief, and I would say this, wouldn't I, is that because of all those changes I made to his character, he became appealing to women. He was always going to be appealing to men. He was always a great fighter. But there are so many movies of great, tough fighters that are only watched by 16-year-old boys. You know, Gladiator isn't like that. Gladiator has, I think, something like 50% of its audience is women. What they saw on screen was their dream man, a man who's very, very strong, but very, very loving.
Between the three writers who then would circulate. So John had burnout, Bill came in, he had burnout, went back to John, and we came back to Bill again. Franzoni is a producer on this, so he's actually just keeping an eye on how things go, because he knows in that area they're better at what they bring to bear than he is, so I think he was very cool about it.
It's not a case of me solving problems and me doing it all, or the other writers. It's this group focus that says we're getting closer all the time to understanding who our characters are and what they want to do. How can we make this absolutely perfect, so nothing's going wrong, so everything follows on from everything else? And I couldn't tell you, looking through it, what's me, and what's Doug, and what's Walter, and what's Ridley, and what's John Logan, and what's David Franzoni, what's Russell Crowe, because he's making suggestions as well. That's how films get made.
I think it was fairly handled, actually. You know, at the end of the day, you've got one thing in mind: how do I make this film the best we can possibly make it?
In that period, weapons were designed to do one thing and one thing only, and that was inflict a fatal wound. They were really vicious weapons. I mean, when you were out there for fighting for your life, there was none of this sort of rules. You were out to kill. Armour means that instead of making specifically suits of armour as such, and helmets, even though we've made a few, we've mainly dealt with the small arms, the side arms, the spears, the bows and the arrows, some crossbows which you can see behind, and other assorted small weapons.
Yeah, we've got a totally different sort of viewpoint on war, and just because of the way society's developed, the way weapons have developed, you know. They have a very, guns are very objective, you know. You can be quite some distance away from somebody with a gun. A sword, which is just basically a large steak knife, you don't have that objectivity, you know. If you want to be successful in a short sword fight, then you are truly 100% involved. It was an extremely brutal life, but no more brutal, say, than Mike Tyson's professional life in the ring, or any number of football players you want to name, you know. That's the modern day equivalent.
You read a lot at the beginning of the film, and then rather than copy, you put all your books to one side and use that knowledge to create something different. I started to look through all the books, and there's not much information. There's not much for this period that's been kept. So it did give us a little bit of a free hand. There's a few examples that have been found of the correct armour. I think there's only about 3 Gladiator helmets that are in existence, so we've just played with it a little bit. The weapons that were used in that period were a spear that you could throw initially. The spears were called pilums, and they were quite a good design because it was made of a soft iron with a hard tip, and when you threw this thing it bent, meaning that the enemy couldn't throw it back to you. Once you'd thrown your spear, you'd advance with your shield and to defend yourself, pushing the enemy back or bowling them over, and then you would draw your sword, which is a gladius. It's called gladius, and I think that's where the word gladiators come from, a sword, the user of the sword. And you would then use that as a thrusting weapon mainly, even though you could cut with it. But the shield, the spear and the sword were the main weapons for the soldier.
Now imagine, the Roman army is stretched out. Their lines are a mile long. You have 5 lines, roughly 1,000 soldiers each. They're not next to each other, there's maybe 6 feet between them, enough room for another man to come between. The second line is stepped over, so that they cover that gap. That means you have no one behind you, so when you draw back your spear to throw, you don't poke someone in the eye. The third line is behind you, but it's 12 feet back. Now, the enemy charge, crashing down towards these 5 thin lines of Roman soldiers who look just like fences before an avalanche. No fence is going to stand up to an avalanche, or are they? Because as they come within 30 yards, a trumpet sounds, back go the arms, and 1,000 javelins hit the enemy. Down they go, rolling over each other, men falling over them, men with spears stuck in their shields, throwing them aside. It's a shambles. And then out come the swords.
I mean, axes, as you see the scale of this axe, it was weighty and would have been made in either bronze or iron. It's quite barbarian style weapon. The Romans were really good at whoever they fought. If they thought they were good, they were like the Japanese of their day. They would take that technology and weaponry and utilize it. We had our bows made for us by a proper bow maker. I think it was in the region of 16,000 arrows just for the flaming ones, and then we went through 10,000 arrows for firing. We did the arrows in 4 days. The special effects had special machines that could launch batteries of them into the air at any one time. But our guys firing them by the conventional way weren't doing that bad either.
Apart from recreating the sense of authentic Roman army equipment, catapults and ballistas and scorpions, machines that fire incredible volleys of arrows and huge terracotta bombs filled with flaming oil on their unfortunate and rather poorly equipped enemies, which is how the Romans did it. That was all equipment that didn't exist. Almost everything had to be made from scratch and be practical.
No! 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 Archers! Ignite! Ignite!
A lot of the things in the arena were tested out. The army would test ways of fighting within the gladiatorial arena that they then might use in battle elsewhere. There was lots of different types of weapons that were used. Most of the people that fought, the gladiators that fought, had a specific way of fighting, and the crowd would follow that man and the way he fought. It's like being in the blue team or the red team. You would come each week to watch your gladiator fight in a specific way, and he would be put up against opponents that would fight in different ways, but he had to fight in his kind of traditional way. Retiarius would use a trident to fight with. He would also have a net. We had a bit of a problem in trying to figure out how you threw this net as well as holding the trident, but we've found a way around it. And our little net's got crabs inserted in it, so the little crabs grab hold of you and cling onto you. These guys would mainly fight somebody called a mammalian, who resembled a fish. He'd have a fish on his helmet, and it was like, you know, the fisherman going out to catch the fish. This is what we think is a Thracian sword. We're not really sure what the bend was for, but I think if somebody's approaching you, and you really know where the point is on a standard sword, not to know where it is. So any movement he does, you would find that you didn't know where it was coming from, so he had a slight advantage on you. We did see a sketch in a book of it. A lot of the references come off old statues, and there's a thing called the Trajan's Column, which gave us a lot of information.
Action! Jack, move your club to the left.
We have a character in the film who we see in the provincial theatre in Morocco, and he's Pluto. He comes out and he dispatches people to the afterlife. He wanders round, and if there's any gladiators laying on the floor looking like they're not going to make it, he'll use this to break their skulls or dispatch them to the afterlife.
Shut the gates, boys. Shut the gates. Family.
This is actually rubber, but it's meant to represent a large piece of bronze.
Good morning.
We were also asked to make a ball and chain, but I've made it a ball and leather. Sounds like an English pub. We've used a lot of soft bits and pieces so people can get really hit in the face and clobbered.
Action!
This sword we have here, we've made this one up. We're probably going to have a scene where somebody's pinned to the wall with their head in there, and one of our actors reaches across, grabs his hair and pulls him forward, thus decapitating him. But whether we'll go that far, I don't know. We've made a crossbow up here, even though this one didn't exist. The technology to make a crossbow was there. They're meant to represent Nubian archers, so they start off with this Nubian-style bow, and they let off about 4 or 5 arrows. And then as the chariots crash, you'll see them start to go for these crossbows which are inside. Each chariot is meant to be like an armoured personnel carrier. Ridley's direction was that he wanted an Uzi type weapon for one of the gladiators to use. So I played around a bit and made this. I couldn't even draw it. I had to make it to figure out how it worked. But it fires 4 arrows, or 4 bolts. You have to fire the top and bottom ones first before you can fire the outer ones. But it does work really well. It does throw them a few yards.
H camera marker.
We've got another character in the film called Tiger, who does some wonderful things with 4 tigers, but this is his sword. So we had to represent a tiger's eye and tiger claws all around here. Everything's looking a little bit weary because it's just come straight from being used. Within the Colosseum, the armoury department must have been quite large. I mean, it had complete areas underneath it where they would prepare. You'd have people working on animals, you'd have people preparing food. So the armoury section, I imagine, would have been very big. You've got the swords, you've got the sharpening of weapons, you've got breakages to service, you've got the whim of whoever's sponsoring the games that week because they want something different made. So I imagine there must have been a lot of armourers there trying to churn it all out.
This is the first production I had worked on which involved armour, great bloody battles, and thousands of legionaries coming over the top of a hill. I think one comes close to nervous breakdowns on most films. And admittedly, it was quite enormous on a daily basis. And then you just start thinking, oh, only 2,500 extras today. It's a light day.
Jan T. Yates has exquisite taste, and part of the challenge was to get the spirit of authenticity. And when you actually see certain Roman actual dress, there's certain things to our eye that sort of look like a toga party, or they seem strange or weird, and she was able to sort of translate them. She'd take the essence of them and find some way that they somehow still felt like what we thought royalty should look like. So she would do the research and still find something that looked right for the characters.
My first meeting with Ridley was very exciting because I was going for an audition, but after 2.5 hours we'd talked through the script and he'd talked through his visions, and it was as if one was sort of virtually totally involved in the film and one had only spent an afternoon with him. Looking back on the epics of yore, we really wanted to get away from that look on Gladiator. We wanted to ensure that everything looked very worn, and so the breaking down department was very, very important to us. We also wanted to make sure that the armour looked very battered and old. We wanted to make all the legionaries look as if they'd lived in their armour for 4 years, which they did, that they hardly washed. One of Ridley's images was that these legionaries should look like Vietnam vets, i.e. they should virtually have a Marlboro packet tucked into their tunics, and their helmets had graffiti on them. It was that sort of feel. We wanted it to be grungy, we wanted it to be gritty and earthy, we wanted rust on the armour, we wanted verdigris, we wanted it. Ridley has a wonderful word, gnarly. Everything pitted, aged, and the same with the tunics, the same with the soft texture fabrics to be as aged and as broken down as possible. Skins to be old and slept in, greasy. Just really getting it as authentic looking as we possibly could.
You look back at the classic Gladiator movies, and oddly enough, there's some great writing and there's some wonderful actors involved, and the thing that really makes them feel cheesy is the way they look, and particularly the costumes. There's just a kind of thin, nothing looks worn, nothing really looks real. It all seems kind of like I don't know, often a high school play. You know, just the truth of wearing sandals and a toga, it's tough. And part of the excitement about going to Ridley, beyond all the other, skills, is just the man's taste.
Also, we wanted to get away from the short skirt department. So we took the image of a Scotsman's kilt for the length of most of the tunics and lengths of body armour. So there wasn't all this tiny little ballerina tutu effect, and it looked, I think, much more effective. It was an enormous history lesson, and really all you can do with any period is research, research, research. You go straight to the British Museum, and then you go straight into the libraries, and then you go straight to the bookshops, and then you go straight to Rome, and you walk around all the columns and all the statues, and you go as far afield as you possibly can to learn as much as you possibly can. We were lucky that we had 6 months preparation. So everything, because everything had to be made from the smallest of buckles all the way through to the largest of armour sets, everything had to be made. All our crowd had to be made. So everything had to be in process from the first 2 or 3 months. The script evolved, but we always knew that we would have to costume up to 3,000 extras at a time, some military, some civilian. So we always knew we had to get a chain gang, we had to get manufacture on board, and we always knew that the fights were going to happen, so we could always work towards the specific set pieces of the fights. So we went up a lot of dead ends trying to find an armour that would be light enough and malleable enough to wear for the thousands of legionaries. Also, good paint finishes, so it looked like the Royal McCoy, even adding bits of rust and verdigris as well. So we ended up using nearly every material because we had aluminium, we had rubber insofar as car bumper rubber that was malleable and light. It's what we made most of the armour out of. And we did have some foam and we did have some fiberglass. And we did have a tiny bit of metal, but just thrown in here and there on the mercenaries and things like that. And of course, lots of leather. I had one specific fabulous armourer for Russell's armour and his team, Ivo Coveney. Then FB Effects took on an awful lot of the bulk making. When we shot Germania, we were shooting in Hampshire in a forest, which had been deforested. But when Ridley wanted snow, it snowed. It was quite extraordinary. We were up to our ears in mud, and everybody was up to their ears in mud and snow, which turned into slush. But that's exactly how Ridley wanted his legionaries. It's exactly how he wanted his barbarians. So everyone was happy. Getting the extras ready was undertaken by my supervisor, Rosemary Burrows, who created these extraordinary costume villages. Now it's with these bigger epics that have been happening subsequently, it's par for the course, but at the time I think we were the first.
I get information from the designer as to what she wants. She does the designs, we find people to make it, as far as the crowd is concerned, and then it's the logistics of actually setting the whole thing up to make it work. Well, they're brought in at that far end in batches, otherwise we have a major stampede. And they're all issued with a number. And that number, they go to the right section along the rail where their costume is hanging either side here. And they are given their costume. They then go into the center section, change, and we have a buddy system where they help one another because we don't have enough staff. And then they bring us back their costume, which we hang on their number section down the rail. And then they come to a little quality control end here where they're checked before they go and hit the mud bath. Really wanted chainmail. Chainmail is kind of like linked metal tunic in a way. And there's a cheap kind of chainmail that you can get that's knitted, and then you silver it, and Ridley didn't want it. It looked phony. And to do it as metal, I mean, you couldn't get the guys to walk in it. It's far too heavy. So someone said, well, why don't we do it in aluminium? But then you have to get aluminium to look old, so you have to dip it in acid. But then we couldn't find anybody for the price to make us 100 suits. And in the end, we found a gentleman up north. He's called Yorkshire Forge. But we suddenly discovered that besides putting shoes on horses, he also makes S&M clothes. So Mr. Kinky from S&M has made the chain mail. The logistics are more difficult on this one for the simple reason that we finish shooting here and immediately go to Morocco. So the logistics of having to try and set up Morocco and not being able to take anything from here because Morocco is instant, it's the day after. And the same thing as that we leave Morocco and are instantly in Malta. So the amount of trafficking and custom sheets of what goes here, where and how many days it takes to get it there, plus the fact we have hired stuff from Rome, and so all the footwears come from Rome. And we had to have thousands of boots made for this.
Maximus starts off as a general. So from an armour point of view, he needed to be quite stupendous, but not flash. He needed to be grand, but not overbearing. So we basically upgraded his armour by just adding a little bit of gold here and there and adding wolf fur. And then, of course, when he is captured, you need to see him go down to the very basic. And then he starts off wearing very basic, thin leather armour when he starts his second fights. And then he inherits the breastplate of Oliver Reed. And if you look at the breastplate, you will see he adds to it as he wins more and more fights. He adds another silver figure to his breastplate involving his family, the Tree of Life. All of Russell's armour was made for him to ride easily, to fight easily, for the stunt fighters to fight easily, to facilitate every kind of action. Apart from the Praetorian Guard, who had to look as if they buffed their armour every day, because they were escorting the emperor and the emperor's family all the time. And then in Rome, we had a specific brief to go pastel for the civilians, to go Alma Tadema was our influence on the Roman crowd, and he was a romantic painter in late 19th century, and his concepts of Rome are fabulous. Very pistachio pink, pale blue, dove grey, lovely light silk colours.
It's amazing. I mean, you look for an actor, the minute I put this on, you just feel like you're in a completely different world. And it's been kind of fantastic exploring that, yet making it feel natural, like it's ours. And, you know, the first time I call them my curtains, because they're just kind of curtainy. But you're putting that on and wearing it as if it's you know, blue jeans.
Commodus is obviously emperor in waiting, so he had the richest fabrics. He had fabulous shot silks, he had hand embroidery, he had 3 sets of armour, one of which was a sort of working armour, which you see in Germania, which he would have been travelling in. The second was a show armour, whereby he'd be opening the games. And the third one, which is the marbleized armour, was an inspiration of Ridley's from a statue to actually bring this veined marble into reality.
This crest is the it's the armor of the Praetorian Guard, which is essentially like the Secret Service, and I have no idea why I'm wearing it.
It was an absolute joy to dress because Connie has the figure of a supermodel. So I had already purchased a lot of fabulous fabric. We were going a lot for shot silks and shot silk satins and a lot of embroidery and hand embroidery. And when we were able to get together, we draped all these bolts of fabric over her and wrapped them round, and she was very involved in it as well. And when I showed the photos to Ridley, he went, "Well, there you are. You've got it," because we hadn't even started making.
They have made these incredible, they are all hand embroidered, they're handmade. The jewels are made especially for this film. This is a real one. I bought this one in an antique store. It's a 2,000-year-old ring, signet ring, and it comforts me to think that someone wore this a long time ago around the same period that we were in.
I had the most wonderful cutter, Annie Hadley, who also created some fabulous looks for her. And in actual fact, although I can't give you the exact amount of appearances, we had something like 18 to 20 outfits. However, we managed to get nearly every fabric purchased on her body at some point or another, what with 7 or 8 components in each outfit, from veils to cloaks to draping to tunics, etc. Oliver Reed was the best fun to design for because he knew his character and he liked to run with it. So when he's in his armour, he's got a little bit more swagger. It's leather, got a bit of a sort of devil-may-care feel about it. We were able to put together, again, my cutter, Annie Hadley, put together some wonderful jellabas in bright colours. And we were able to dress him up with the maddest of jewellery to give him this sort of completely over-the-top Eastern dealer, wheeler dealer, really, which is what he was. Everything had to be different when we arrived in Morocco because, of course, all the extras were completely differently clothed. They were in Moroccan jellabas, they were, but of their time. Nowadays, if you asked 2,000 or 3,000 extras to turn up in their jellabas, they would probably be wearing Nike trainers and the jellabas would be bright green. So we had to dress every single extra. And again, Rosemary created this wonderful costume village in the middle of the desert. Marcus Aurelius, obviously being emperor, had to have the best of all things, and he had handmade armour in metal and leather. He loved everything about it. He said he felt very magisterial wearing it. And as I visited him a couple of times, obviously for fittings, he loved to live in pyjamas. So anything long and robe-like he was very happy with.
This is the Roman cuirass, which, being that I'm a high military man of rank, it's very elaborate. It has lions, it has various things. This is a ribbon, which signifies a rank. They had different colors ribbons for different ranks. I have my sword, the Praetorian sword, because it's purple, which was the color of royalty. These are armor to protect your forearms, armor to protect your ankles. This is the ring, which symbolizes the office, which was a seal. It's an eagle, which always symbolizes Rome.
The senators, of whom Derek Jacobi, of course, was the leader, we used a richer fabric than has been used before. We also lined them in black instead of the senatorial burgundy. And so therefore their togas and their tunics were thicker and richer, but they did stand out in that they were a little more richly draped in fabric. Coming to Tiger's armour, Ridley had a vision of a helmet that would lift. It was based on a French fireman's helmet that the visor lifts on, and then it was carved, originated beautifully by our armour makers. He has claws as his shoulder guards, he has claws, and he has tigers' heads on the top of his greaves to protect his knees. And he basically actually was such a fine figure of a man, he did the rest for us. The Maltese extras were quite fun to work with. They would turn up with various eyebrows pierced, and they wouldn't take off their Ray-Bans or Rolex watches. So we had to go on crowd scanning on a daily basis to remove, again, trainers and various bits and bobs. I'm sure you'd be able to see one or two if you scan the crowd. One always felt one was experiencing something very special filming Gladiator, because it hadn't been done for such a long time, and also one could see what Ridley was putting on the screen, and it was just stunning.